Hi,
And just
everyone. So I'm with Dan Simons and Christopher Chabris. I hope I've pronounced both names right. And you should know that I've been quite nervous and been doing some more preparation than I would normally do because I'm in the presence of two highly intelligent professors of psychology who are quite good at finding out about you and examining stuff. And so in any case, you may have already heard this, but I think that there's a disconnect between the world that Simons and Chabris inhabit and the world that investors inhabit. And we need to bring those worlds closer, or at least we investors really ought to pay more attention to the work that cognitive psychologists are doing. And what I realized from this new book of theirs that is about to come out is that, or perhaps when you've read it, it will have already come out, is that we're kind of scratching the surface, and there's an enormous amount more to it. And I guess I guess I will pitch the question to. I've been asked to pitch the question to one or the other, so I will start with Dan because I know less about you than I know about Chris. So could you, they're the authors, if you didn't know, of an extremely famous book and experiment called The Invisible Gorilla. But so what's happened since you published that, and what prompted you to put this together and write this book?
well, a lot of things, and we really enjoyed writing the first book, and that it was a fun process for us, kind of doing the background research for it, and we wanted to do another one, and it just took us a really long time to come up with the right framing for the sorts of ideas that we've been thinking about and batting around for years. So after the first book came out, we continued sort of collecting information and getting ideas, and we tried several times to kind of put together a book plan, an outline, and it never quite held together the way that we wanted it to. But we had lots of content, and I think one of the key points we came to was that there was a central theme, which is that a lot of the examples that we came across had to do with how we tend to fall victim to deception, how we tend to not recognize when we might be misleading ourselves, or not asking ourselves the right sorts of questions, or not thinking about the kinds of information that is really important, but it's not right in front of us, that we're missing. And all of those themes sort of came together into this idea that we can better understand how deception works by understanding sort of the cognitive architecture, the habits that we have, the ways of thinking that we have, and the kinds of information that tends to draw us in when maybe we should be a little more skeptical of it. And that framing kind of brought it all together for us, so that we were able to sort of piece together all of the content that, well, I shouldn't say all of the content, maybe a third of the content that we came across over the last dozen years into something that was cohesive.
And just to learn a little bit more about you, was I right that you play both chess and bridge?
Yeah, neither as well as Chris plays chess or poker, but yeah, I played chess since high school. Not regularly anymore, but I played a lot of tournament chess in high school and occasionally since then. And I picked up bridge, maybe 20 years ago, and I've played sporadically. I played for about 10 years pretty regularly, and then my second kid was born, and I've played a lot less since then.
And
But
I won't do. I plan not to do it, but I'm in serious danger of falling into wanting to talk about chess, which is not the purpose of this, and that my listenership is not chess. But I should just let the listener know that I haven't seen the Queen's Gambit, but it's something with, I've got friends in the math faculty in University of Zurich, and one guy started showing me the chess that he's playing on Lee Chess, and I discovered chess.com, which is just an absolutely fantastic way to play chess. I play correspondence chess, 7 days a move, and I'm a little worried that I'm addicted, and I'm thinking, so when I play a lot of chess or any game, you see the world in terms of that, and so I need to make sure that I don't fall into that. But I will share with you, you can study, you can study as many different patterns in chess as you like, say by doing tactics. But when you get into a game, one of the things you need to know is when to pause and think, and when to play. And actually, in your book, there's the example of somebody who was obviously cheating. And one of the ways they identified that he was cheating was he was taking the same amount of time between moves. But one of the things that, as I went through that, I should tell the listener, the book is so chock full, we're going to kind of just skim the surface. But there's a similar phenomenon in that I'm faced with a world of data coming in at me all the time, and I have to decide when I stop and do some of the many things that you talk about in the book, and when I can skip, when I can use my intuition, when I should not trust my intuition, and and how do you know what those signals are? So I guess I'm going to dive into you, Chris, to respond to me on the chess, and to say something about it if you like. And by the way, Chris also appears on chess podcasts, which is kind of fun. And I love the photograph, sorry, because I did some research of you playing chess against the guy in Harvard Yard, because I played against that guy in Harvard Yard when I was at Harvard Summer School all those years ago, except I lost to him every time and you won. But that question of when to pause, when to stop and not trust your intuition, and when to allow your sort of like shortcuts to continue is really critical. And I don't know if you want to address any of that, Chris. Have a go.
I'll do my best. I guess the first thing to say is I resonate quite a bit with your fear of getting sucked down the rabbit hole of playing chess all the time and focusing on chess and not on other things. Because when that photo of me playing chess against the chess master in Harvard Square was taken, I was probably spending too much time in Harvard Square playing chess and should have been spending more time on other things.
If I may interject for the listener, it didn't help that you were doing your PhD on using chess players as the subject matter, and it was on cognitive behavior around chess. So that was not helpful. But
well, that was good actually, because and Dan was actually on my PhD committee, one of the faculty members on the committee when I defended my PhD thesis. It was about how chess masters think, essentially, broadly stated. And by being involved in the chess community and by being a relatively high-ranking player, I actually knew and had access to lots of chess masters and even grandmasters who could participate in my studies. So it actually was a very good synergy to be able to combine those. I think when it comes to the question of sort of when to think more and when to play on intuition or to think less, there's actually a whole sort of sub literature inside the vast literature of chess playing about playing chess on what they call critical moments. So in retrospect, we can often see what the critical moment was, because we can see, oh, here's the place where I made the mistake that cost me the game. And nowadays, computer engines will basically analyze the game and say, up to this point, the game was equal. And then after you made this move, you were lost. So in retrospect, that's the critical moment. But when you were thinking about that move, did you realize that that was the critical moment? And that's a hard skill to learn. There are various pieces of advice on that. But it's not necessarily that easy. And I think the analogy probably does apply to your world, and also I think to all of our worlds when it comes to situations where you might possibly be making a big mistake and being deceived or defrauded or something like that. So I think one surprising thing that we noticed when working on this book and studying various cons and frauds and so on is how often people made very big decisions with apparently very little consideration. It was as though they were playing the biggest blunder of the game, but they made it almost instantly, not realizing that might be, the moment to think more. And I'm even thinking of, people who invested with Bernie Madoff, for example. Some of them did it purely just based on, the recommendation of a relative or someone vouched for them, and so on. And, putting all your savings with a single manager, is probably something you want to think about a little bit. However, they might have tremendous integrity and great strategy and great expertise, but that seems like maybe a critical moment for your financial future, given that catastrophe could happen. Not highly likely, but if it does happen, very, very bad, right?
Go ahead, Dan.
I was just saying one insight that comes from chess, but that is relevant for non-chess players and might be relevant in this sort of context, is performing a blunder check. So even if you've been thinking about a move, if you were saying you play correspondence chess, you're taking a long time to think about every move. And you're thinking about a lot of different paths and a lot of different opportunities. So you're doing that critical thinking, and then you end up making a move that loses the game or loses a piece because you didn't kind of stop back and say, okay, am I doing something really dumb here? Right? And just that question, right, which kind of insight that came out of chess, but applies to everything. Right? Just asking yourself that question, am I doing something really dumb here? And just thinking about that for a minute can stave off a lot of mistakes, right? It's a really nice tactic. Just, often people don't even ask themselves that question. They don't ask, should I be investing everything with one money manager?
My wife asks me that question all the time, but somehow I just ignore it. In that she says, "Are you doing something really dumb?" And I just, so we go to the Madoff thing, and so there's a part of the book that discusses Madoff, and it quotes somebody who is responding to somebody who's asking this very question that you're asking, Dan, and the person says, "Oh, no, he doesn't understand. Bernie Madoff would never screw us. He would never." And I'll just give you, and it's so I should let the listener know that I read the book with trepidation. I didn't word search straight to my name, but I get this email from Chris saying, "And by the way, you're in the book," or something like that. And I'm like, "Oh, let me help you." So it's great because Chris and Dan describe something from my book related to me walking into Bill Ackman's office and realizing that my due diligence on this company called Farmer Mac was, wasn't worth anything. And so this concept of the short circuit, so we just saw it Bernie Madoff. I mean, they even got prompted to ask the question, and they were short-circuited by saying, "Oh no, Bernie Madoff would never mess us over." And in my case, the company describes these pools of farm mortgages described in the 10K. And I take it on face value and I say, this is a government regulated agency. I'm reading it in the 10K. These are diversified pools of mortgages. One of the first things I learned in Bill Ackman's office, he's just gone one step lower and he's downloaded the offering documents for many of these diversified pools of mortgages that Farmer Mac is sponsoring. And he says, "Do you realize they're not diversified?" I'm like, I didn't look at any of them. I just took it on face value. I thought that they were. And he said, "Well, no, they're not. They're just like business loans." And I say, I say these words. This is not in the book. I say, "Bill, it's a government-sponsored agency. What, he just looks at me and says, you have far too much trust, guy, in the government." And actually, and I would tell the listener, there is just, the book is so chock full, there's no way we can cover the massive range that's in the book. So you have to read the book for that part. But you get two short circuits there. And where is the voice that says, if I hadn't run into Bill Ackman on this topic, that says, have you gone one step deeper? Should you go one step deeper?
Yeah. I think I really enjoyed that story from your book, not least of which that you were willing to write about a mistake that you made or something that in retrospect you thought you could have done a lot better. Not that many people are willing to put that in in their memoirs while they're still in the business, and it was I think an excellent example of a couple of things that we mention in the book. One is just sort of that asking one more question, going one step deeper, right? I don't think there is a clear formula for when you should, how to know when you should go one step deeper. But the important thing is to realize that you could be going deeper, right? So once you saw, my interpretation of your story is, once you saw what Ackman was doing with the same investment idea, you saw that you could go, you could go deeper, and
I could have gone.
Yeah, well, in the future, maybe you did, yes. And after that, this happened, this happened like 20 years ago or something like that, 18 years ago, right? So probably you changed your habits after after that a little bit, and that's that's great. Also, this idea of due diligence, I think, comes up also. So at one point in the book, we talk about the virtue of asking more questions, being a jerk sometimes, asking more questions either of other people or of yourself or of the data. And sometimes the answer you get is, "Oh, well, we did our due diligence." And so what this anecdote shows for us, I think, also is that there are different levels of due diligence, right? Sort of what you were maybe already doing more than what a lot of people would regard as due diligence before they make an investment decision, but Ackman was doing even more. So there are no standards for things like due diligence. There are lots of phrases like this in any business or any industry or in life, which are sort of empty of meaning because there's no standard that they correspond to. There's almost ways of sort of like shutting off your inquiry by saying, oh yeah, we did our due diligence, we're following best practices, we have best in class technology or something like that. The empty phrases, that don't
Yeah.
actually, they should actually be red flags rather than, green lights almost, like when people start throwing that stuff out, you maybe really need to dig deeper at that point.
Yeah. And Dan, did you want to comment on that?
And there are a whole bunch of these sorts of phrases. It's been validated, right?
Well, I have, just so the listener knows, I first of all went through the way I think that the way I would want to describe the material in the book is that the brain is such a sort of like a leaky contraption that there are kind of no overarching, I would argue, based on what I've seen, there's no overarching structure to a book on this topic. And you guys did valiantly in coming up with it. And it's sort of like 2 parts and 4 parts on each side. So a bit like chess, it seems to me. I mean, somebody said to become a chess master, there's about 50,000 patterns that the brain needs to recognize, and some of them happen intuitively. And I think that on some level, what people like decision makers, any decision maker needs to do is to just keep sifting over this material. And the more we sift over it, the more likely we are to kind of identify those patterns. I'll give you another story from my life that's not in a book right now, but since I wrote that book, I suffered a bankruptcy in my portfolio. So that is the polar opposite of what you want in an investment portfolio. And so I didn't do my pre-mortem, which is something that is brought up in the book, which is, if this is going to fail, how might it fail? And I think that that's a phenomenal question that I've added to my checklist that would have helped me. But this was a company that was taking on debt to build a new plant that ended up costing twice as much and taking twice as long and that actually ran it into business problems, ultimately such that because of the extra debt, that the company was actually lost to the creditors. And, if you think of that key moment, the key moment is that I'm asking the company if I can go visit the plant, and they're saying, we're not quite ready, and actually we're in the quiet period, and they're kind of humming and hawing a little bit. And that would have been a signal for me to get super curious, and I didn't. And so I guess, what am I bringing up to you? The opportunities for these cognitive errors are just everywhere and just replete. I actually think that one of the ways that certainly I've done this, and my book is an exercise in this, and I've done more of this subsequently, is assume I'm not rational. And that's something that I'm not sure how, because I feel like I've used this analogy, I don't know if you've come across it, drunks in bars. So, if I'm a drunk in a bar and I want to make sure that I reach for the right drink, I'm going to kind of array them in front of me. I'm going to make it easy to make the right decision and more difficult to make the wrong decision. And I need to set up my environment in such a way that, because I'm going to make these random moves, that any random move I make is less likely to be damaging, if you like. I don't know if that resonates with you at all, or if you have any commentary on my other portfolio mistake. We could do psychotherapy, and I could just sit and talk portfolio psychotherapy, and I could talk to you about my portfolio mistakes, and you guys could use it as material for your decision-making cognitive science stuff. But go ahead, Dan.
The fact that you're thinking about portfolio mistakes is really the first step, right? in addressing any problems. If you don't think about your mistakes and you only focus on your successes, you don't improve, right? But I was going to maybe restructure something a little bit, how you framed or how we kind of go about the world. I don't think it's actually irrational, right? The vast majority of what we do, our kind of habits and ways of thinking, are really efficient and effective the vast majority of the time. And I think that's a central sort of impression we want to kind of leave in our book, that this isn't just people being dumb. Right? This is people most of the time doing exactly what is most efficient for interacting in their world, right? And we have to be efficient because we have limited resources. So
we got a brain that operates on like 25, is it 25 watts of electric power is the amount of energy that the brain consumes? And it's not much, is it?
Well, I mean, there's more information than we can process at any given time, right? There are more things that we can do at any given time than we're capable of doing. So we have to pick and choose in some ways. And for the most part, we're pretty good at it, right? It's only when, in these contexts of deception, right, either self-deception or others deceiving us, that those sorts of effective habits kind of get hijacked, right, and lead us down the wrong path. So, that company that was hemming and hawing about you visiting their plant, yeah, that's a red flag. But and that would in a sense be a case of deception. It's not overtly lying to you, but it's not giving you the information that you need, right?
Yeah.
And those are the situations where our tendency to want to be efficient can kind of end up hurting us, right? It's most of the time it'd be fine to not go and bother visiting a plant, because most of the time, it's going to be what they say it is, right?
Yes.
But every now and then it's not.
And I think that there's probably an executive education course for investors that the two of you or your people in your field could have a lot of fun with people like me, because you'd be sharing experiences and sharing insights, and people like me would be giving you lots of material and data for you to kind of then go and use in one way or another. I think that's, I mean, I'm in danger of going down rabbit holes, but they're so interesting. So one of the things that I come across that is apparent to me, and you need to forgive me, Dan, because I thought I'd only be interviewing Chris, but so I've done less research on you, but it seems like you I don't know if it's your area of academia, but you're really good at partnerships. So I really enjoyed reading Chris has appeared with various different partner writers in all the leading press, and so there's an element of like partnership, and there's an element, I mean, you guys collaborated on a book all that time ago, and you're still friends and collaborating today. That's not necessarily very easy. How does that work?
We look at Danny Kahneman and Amos Tversky and what they accomplished, and we say we want to be like them. No, that's a sure. That's probably not the right answer.
But it's probably part of the answer.
Yeah, well, I mean, I'll tell you a funny thing is that when I first met, well, I don't know when I first met Dan, because I don't think we remember exactly when that was. But when he first became a professor at Harvard, I actually confused him for his brother, whom I had known when his brother was a student at Harvard. And they don't look entirely different. They're pretty close in age, maybe a year or two apart or something like that. So I sort of felt like I already knew him, but that was an illusion, So maybe that sort of the entire process. But I don't really know exactly what the secret is, except that I do write a lot of pieces with other people, and I think one of the reasons for that is that it can be an excellent sort of commitment mechanism to have a partner working on the process with you, and someone who you've worked with many times before. Ultimately at some point you've got to deliver, and you've got to take care to make sure that what you do is good quality stuff, and that it reflects well on both of you. I don't really know what the magic is, what the magic is in there.
For me, it's openness to criticism, right? So if you're working with somebody who's willing to criticize you and willing to take criticism and adjust how you think and how you argue, that can lead to a longer term collaboration. In academics, it's quite common, especially in our subfield. It's quite common to collaborate with many people, right?
Well, it's special to see, I think, and I think for me in my world, I think it's probably unusual. Something that came up for me was a book that was written by Michael Eisner called sort of like Partnerships, The Secret to Success. And he analyzes various different partnerships, business and other, that have led to sort of synergistic, better outcomes for both. But another thing that comes up, so you have the world misleads us because the world is a random place, and heuristics that work well most of the time fail us at other times. But then there are whole business models that are built on convincing people that something is true that is not true, and they take advantage of these heuristics. And I just get the sense, Chris, and probably Dan as well, that those, I mean, they must get your goat because you write about them, and you write about them in a pretty vehement way with no fear, because you will name and shame. Many people will name about it, and we could dive into examples. I mean, I'm not sure that there's some pretty famous authors. You can look it up. I'm not sure that I need to, I don't think I want to be in the position of inviting somebody to name and shame. But and I guess to tee it up for you, what is some people are more interested in the story and they don't care if it's true. And what I get from you, Chris, is that when something is not true, it really bugs you, and you're extremely empirical.
I think that's true, that when people say things that are not true, it really bugs me. That is definitely the case. And I'm sure I say things that are not true sometimes also, but try to minimize it. I think you sort of put your finger a little bit on this, the story aspect of things, because we are all attracted to good stories. And there's good reason. There's good reason for that. Aside from the entertainment value, I think stories are often a way that we communicate cause and effect. Something happens at the beginning, something happens at the end, and there's sort of some connection between those. So they're very effective communication and persuasion devices, but they are not often properly reflective of what the cause and effect relationship really is. And it's easy to fall into that trap of thinking that something that makes a good story, or hearing a good story and sort of forgetting to ask the questions of, whether the first thing really caused the second thing, or whether this is a representative example, or, something, that happened by accident, when we're making too much of it. And I think it's true, many writers, even scientists, even some scientists who write about science, sort of fall into that trap of making too much of particular narratives, and ignoring what the best evidence really says. I don't want to pretend, but I don't want to pretend like I'm somehow immune to this, or Dan is immune to whatever. This is like part of human nature, in my opinion, at least. And we need to sort of, be vigilant to notice when we're falling into that trap.
I was just gonna say, we all get things wrong, right? Everybody gets things wrong, right? That's just human nature. Nobody's perfect, right? And the thing that irks me is not keep people getting things wrong, right? That's okay. Put an idea out there, it gets shot down. Okay, that's fine.
Yeah.
That's how science works. That's how critical thinking works. What I find irksome is doubling down, right? So you've gotten something wrong, or you put something out there, you put out an interesting idea, you tell a great story about it, somebody comes along and does it better with a lot more evidence, a lot more data, and says, no, that's not right. And not being willing to think about the possibility that you're wrong, to take in that evidence and kind of build it into your model of the world, that's what I find frustrating, because it's not science anymore. When you're not willing to sort of consider the evidence as a whole and say, okay, maybe I'm wrong about this, then you're not actually doing science, you're doing storytelling.
And one of the for the listeners' interest, it just prompts me for one of the many heuristics that's in the book, where what you write is just ask yourself what would you think is the reality if the evidence had come in a different order, and you show how if the evidence came in one way, there's a tendency just to agree. When the smaller study, and then you get the bigger study that invalidates it, but the smaller study, but if it was the other way around. So go ahead, Chris. I can see you're going to explain it better than me.
I would love to expand. I would love to expand on that story. I mean, what you describe is sometimes called the time-reversal heuristic, and it comes from Andrew Gelman, who's a statistician and political scientist. I think he's the first one to mention it. We heartily agree that if it's very easy to be seduced by the order in which you received information, and the first thing you receive then sort of has a special priority, a special weight, and things you heard later, will have to be extremely powerful to overcome the fact that you believed one of those things before the other. The example we give in the book is a study that was published, maybe 10 years ago now, in which 40 Princeton University undergraduates were the participants. And the claim from the research study was that if you give them sort of confusing math problems in a hard to read font or typeface, the difficulty they have reading it will sort of activate in their minds the general concept of difficulty and make them work harder to actually solve them. Therefore, they will get more problems right, paradoxically, when the problems are hard to read compared to when they're easy to read, printed in normal font and so on. And this was, this paper was published in a great journal. Malcolm Gladwell used this as a big example in his book, David and Goliath. He talked about it as an example of this concept of desirable difficulty, which is a sort of an established concept in cognitive psychology, where sometimes challenging things, can be a better way of learning than easy things. True in chess also, right? Like every chess coach will advise people to solve hard chess puzzles, not easy chess puzzles, and push yourself to the point where you can't do it. Anyhow, the problem is that this was a study done on 40 Princeton University undergraduates with frankly implausible results. And some other researchers decided to try to replicate this finding and see if they could get the same results. And once they had done that on a total of 8,000 participants, which is, I don't know if my math is going to be right, but I think something like 200 times the number in the original study, like 2 orders of magnitude more participants, they found no difference at all between reading these math, these sort of math brain teasers in a hard font or an easy font. And they got that article published, which is good. Like at least the scientific literature is publishing sort of what effectively amount to corrections. But I was looking in a popular book somewhat after that, incidentally co-authored by Jonah Lehrer, who's an author who's also had a little bit of trouble with making dubious claims in the past. And the funny thing was, the book mentions the first study with the 40 students, and then it mentions the second study briefly with the 8,000 more diverse participants, and then their conclusion is clearly more research is needed on this topic. And my reaction is the 8,000 students was the more research that was needed, and that research is over and the results are clear. We can move on now. And so I think that really gets you to the time reversal heuristic, because if someone had done a study with 8,000 people and found no effective fonts, would anyone then have done a study with 40 people, let alone got it published, let alone have everyone believe it? It's possible, but seems kind of unlikely, right?
I think two things to that. I'll just pause and see if Dan, you want to add anything.
No, that pretty much captures the idea.
So this is what really bothers me about that story and a number of others. What if that researcher telling truth who's just taken truth serum responds to you like this? He says, I had a hunch that the data that it might not be borne out in a larger study, but it was just too good a story. And I knew that I could get it published with my 40 participants. And, that's the way that science goes. And if I would have just disproven it with the 8,000, nothing would have happened. And then you go one step further, which is, if somebody comes along and says, I know that it's been debunked by the larger study, but isn't it such a great story to tell? And the story, what comes up for me is a book that I have not yet properly read by Schiller, Narrative Economics, where the story is so attractive that even though it's provably false, we still tell it.
Yeah, I mean, that certainly can happen. You'll have this sort of perpetuation of ideas despite a complete lack of evidence supporting them. I think it's a little dangerous to assume that the researchers themselves were motivated purely by the story and getting, I think there is some careerism. There is some sort of, hey, I'm going to get this out there even if I'm wrong. But I think more often than not, people just fooled themselves into thinking that they actually had a really neat discovery, right? And didn't either have the statistical chops to kind of look at what they were doing and realize this is too big of an effect to be believable, or were so persuaded that this one statistically significant result was meaningful that they went ahead and published. So I don't know that it's the sort of thing where they say, right, I don't think this is right, but I'm going to publish it anyway. But it could be in some cases, in cases of people who are frauds, that would be what happens. But
in our little seminar here, sort of like a preview to the course that the two of you will put together, where the participants come up with stories from their own lives. So on a podcast, I tell a story about, and I'm fearful of saying it because to tell a story is to perpetuate it, and it's not a true story. But I tell a story of an untrue story that I've read somewhere on a blog, somewhere semi-legitimate. It's not the New York Times, but it's not just something that I heard in a cafeteria, where there was purportedly a study done by Fidelity on the portfolios of dead people. It looks like, Dan,
I ran across that.
And somebody emails me after, you said, that story is completely false. And I was kind of shocked. And I think that so that's an example of my life where that happened. And it's kind of horrible because it's out there in the ether, and I repeated the story. And I kind of I tweeted out corrections and what have you, but so I participated in that.
Well, and that's a perfect example because it kind of fits a narrative that people would like to have. So the idea was that the claim was, and this actually, from what I understand from looking back into it, came from just an anecdote mentioned on a podcast, right? A very prominent podcast, but it was an anecdote mentioned on a podcast about some employee who had come from Fidelity and said they had done an internal study and looked at which portfolios were most successful. And it turns out it was dead people, because they didn't update, they didn't constantly rebalance, they didn't change anything, they just let it ride. So it kind of feeds into that idea that, you know, letting things sit a while is possibly the best way to do that sort of an investment, and not trying to actively manage every moment of every investment. So it fits into that sort of message really nicely. But if you think about it for a minute, that doesn't make any sense, right? I mean, if they actually were dead people, Fidelity would have a responsibility to kind of close those accounts and report them. And maybe you could imagine a study where people had forgotten about their portfolios and those did well, but it was just an anecdote from one person that was hearsay, right? It wasn't even a direct report. But it's a perfect example of the sort of idea that misinformation like this can kind of get passed along when it perfectly matches what you want to see. You tend not to question it as much. If it matches your predictions and what you kind of want to believe, it's much harder to counter it. I mean, we talk about other examples of this in
yeah, the book takes a number of examples, especially from the political domain, which are also fascinating. And you know, I don't know if you'll get into hot water as different people read about the biases that are revealed there, but I'll take you, you know, something that I think that I become more aware of talking to you is that in certain parts of the stock market, it's not that somebody's sitting in a room thinking up a narrative that's not necessarily true. It's that potential narratives that could go viral are being thrown at the market in high volume constantly. And the ones that go viral do go viral because every permutation has been tried. And so I would tell you that no investor who's been sentient over the last 20 years is not going to be aware of the extraordinary success story of Amazon. And all the investors who missed it, which is most of us, is going to say, where is the next Amazon? And because there's a whole bunch of people who are saying, where is the next Amazon? There are going to be dozens, if not hundreds of companies where the array of what one would see as a potential investor in those companies looks similar to Amazon. And then a smart CFO perhaps, or investor relations person, and a couple of other people will, maybe not even consciously, this is my theory, will contrive a narrative that doesn't say we're the next Amazon. But there's an example I write about in my annual report this year of a company where, and I think that this is what's it's so shocking to me because, and again, it's this idea of short circuiting. I mean, I know the analysis, I know how to read accounts, I'm not a dumb guy, I can ask questions, I'm not going to get fired if I ask questions, I'm not living in a totalitarian state or anything. And so the numbers on or presentation of a company called Carvana, which is a well-known implosion over the last 18 months, paints a story that they're going to dominate the used car market with this incredible new business model. And it's only after I never owned it, after the stock cratered, that I looked at some, very simple measure of what's the cash flow from operations and saw ballooning numbers. But as I sat in the presentation, I just felt stupid. But I didn't, questions that I would have normally asked were not asked. And many people got infected by the narrative and went and bought into it. And what am I trying to say? I guess I don't even know that reading your book is it ought to arm us. I mean, in a certain way, this is way harder than chess, because at least the chessboard is not contriving to mislead you. Whereas in a certain way, this conflation of factors is contriving to mislead you. I don't, in fact, I would just tell you, and that you make me less depressed. I really did. I'm kind of boning up on this because I don't want to disappoint these two incredible professors written this incredible book. And I'm getting quite depressed because I just think there's no hope for the human mind. I mean, you said nicely, Dan, that we are quite rational in most cases, but gee, we're capable. And the moments when we become irrational, the moments when this stuff passes us by, we're not going to even be aware of it. I don't know. You want to comment on the Carvana story?
Chris, do you want to?
Yeah, I mean, I could say, I mean, it strikes me as sort of similar to a lot of similar stories where like someone was going to roll up, a whole industry where there were lots of little independent businesses, and somehow they were going to like buy them all or dominate them all. It seems like a familiar narrative, and that's happened in different industries. Also, the kind of the Amazon reference, I think I've had the impression from the work we've done in the book that in the sort of ultra small cap market, there's a lot more storytelling and a lot more sort of decorating the board of directors with people, and frankly outright lying about operations and revenue and so on. This seems like more common than we would hope, and I think where the hope should come from for you, where you should not be so depressed, is something you mentioned earlier, where the drunk in the bar, right? So even the drunk in the bar like arranges his own drink right in front of him, so that if he reaches out, he's going to find his own drink, and not knock over somebody else's drink or whatever. So there are things you can do to um, make your vigilance a little bit more automatic, and to make it a little less just the responsibility weighing on your own mind of having to be a perfect decision maker and so on. So we have the sort of well-known story in the book about Van Halen and their brown M&Ms. They had a very complicated stage show back in the 1980s with all kinds of pyrotechnics and rigging and so on, and if anything went wrong in that, someone could really get hurt, especially them. So when they got to a new city with their tour, they had a rider on their contract that said, in our dressing room must be a bowl full of M&Ms with no brown ones. And the first thing they would do when they got to the venue was check the bowl of M&Ms and see if the brown ones had been properly taken out. And if they hadn't, then they would start to wonder about how well the crew did in arranging everything else. So I don't know exactly what the analogy is for investing. Sometimes maybe checklists are involved, or other checks. Sometimes it's actually collaboration, right? So like getting another critical person to look at what you're doing. In the book, we also have some stories of people who were sort of about to be deceived in a very big way, and a friend, or a colleague or a business partner said literally words like, "This seems like a scam right now," or "This guy is a con artist," and if you can have someone like that who just looks at it fresh, often once we've looked at something long enough, we don't do the blunder check. We've sort of become committed to the idea, and it can require a very independent, look at things. And that's ideally like what's going on in science, right? To take it back to something we talked about earlier, you've got independent scientists looking at our results and checking them and so on. The process doesn't always work, but at least there it's kind of institutionalized in a way that maybe it could be in more settings. I think it is a bit despairing to say like, oh yeah, I'm just going to perfect my mind and be completely rational and never miss anything. Like it can't do that. If you read our book, you will, I think, learn a few things that will help you do better, but maybe one of the most important is to not rely totally on yourself, but to try to set up mechanisms that will help prevent this before you make the final decision.
And every field has its sort of automated checks, like the Van Halen one, right? And in science, for example, we do things like, if we're doing a survey or a study, we'll throw in questions that should have obvious answers, right? Like, pick the middle option, right? Or, for this long question, pick answer C, right? And if people miss those, right, then they're really not paying attention. We shouldn't trust their answers to anything else. It's kind of like people saying, oh yeah, we did our due diligence. It's like, okay, no, you haven't. If you've done your due diligence, you would tell us what your due diligence actually was, because why not show us? If you say we're really transparent, it's like, well, you're almost certainly not if you're saying you're really transparent, because you could just show that you are providing all the information people need.
Yeah, and I enjoyed the discussion. There's a discussion in the book which probably doesn't help investors, in which there are ways of identifying whether a set of sort of survey data result or empirical data might have been randomly generated. There's a shape to the data if it was actually pulled out of reality, which is kind of fun and fascinating. I think there's a whole science there. I mean, I think that when you bring that up, Chris, there's this concept of equivalent to the Van Halen story of just quality of earnings, looking at how the management is changing how they're reporting about something, and looking at why did they make that change, and does that reveal something more that they're perhaps trying to hide? I mean, there's some obvious ones, like just when an earnings report comes out late. There may be more subtle examples and might make sense to read 10Ks. But the market has just come off a phase where none of that was going on. In fact, people were laughed at for doing that because that was kind of boring and old school. And there was a whole bunch of new analyses there. And if you weren't with this new and hip analysis, then you didn't really understand. You weren't keeping up with the times, if you like. Go ahead, Chris.
Oh, I was just going to say that I think a lot of those things in my limited experience are often disclosed sort of in footnotes or parentheses or something like that. The headline of the earnings report is, we changed our accounting, we changed our accounting practices, now here's what we're going to do, right? It's buried someplace in there. So reading the footnotes, I recommend reading the footnotes in our book. There's a lot of good stuff in the footnotes that didn't make it into the main text. But I agree that sort of looking for, checking for those flags is definitely worthwhile in a lot of areas, right? So in like a scientific article, often the way they're structured is like, you read the introduction, you read the description of the results, and you read the discussion, and you're like, great story. But then you go to like a supplementary file, or you go to the small print, the methods and the data analysis are actually printed in smaller print at the end. I mean, those are the places where you've got to really look carefully, and even the data itself, to find out, was this analyzed correctly? Is it maybe fraudulent data entirely? I'm sure there's an analogy there with accounting and with reading financial statements and balance sheets and so on.
And you see a disconnect.
Go ahead.
You just see a disconnect between what was actually done and what the story is, right?
And so this, I haven't put together scientific papers, and now, because we have to produce a report for the company that manages the fund, I have more insight into what happens when you put financial statements together. And I sort of like was saying this to an analyst recently, and they should realize that what goes into a footnote and what goes into the management discussion analysis is itself probably a negotiation and a discussion between the management and the auditor. And the auditor will come along and say, we should put this up bold in the management discussion analysis. And the management will say back to the auditor, oh, that's really uncomfortable. Can we just leave it as a footnote? So, realize that even the table of contents on a proxy statement was a negotiation. The lawyers want to flag something, and maybe the management don't want it flagged. And so it's kind of, I don't know if you call that forensic reading or it's meta reading in a certain sense.
It honestly, it reminds me of a story that we didn't include in the book, but is exactly like what we could have, which is the Wirecard story. You probably know the German company Wirecard, which sort of flamed out into nothingness a couple of years ago. And there's a great book about this that came out not long ago. When the author of the book, who was a Financial Times reporter who followed the story for a long time, sort of narrates the whole thing, like every year the company was changing its auditors, negotiating with the auditors, delaying all of these things you listed right now. They were doing pretty much every year for several years, and eventually even bringing the auditors to obscure Philippine bank branches where they had sort of stooges there telling them, false things about the amount of cash that Wirecard had in accounts in these Philippine banks, even though it's a German company. All of these things were happening, and yet, the stock was being promoted, and it was, doing, great. And there was even, the story of Wirecard, to bring it back to the concept of a story, the story of Wirecard, which was like a German tech company, like an internet tech company, fintech and so on, which was going to sort of put Germany on the map in that industry the way, it hadn't previously been. Apparently the German regulators even bought into that to some extent and became more protective of the company than of investors who might have been being defrauded by the company. It's an amazing story that has so many of these elements in it that I think you might be able to notice from the outside a little bit better if you think in the terms we've been discussing.
And the term that comes up for me, and there's an analogy there. So there I am sitting in the Carvara presentation. Why didn't I speak up? It was my own conference. Why don't I put my hand up and say, why is this not being reflected? I see that they're eating up cash that is just being provided by the capital markets. Are you concerned? I didn't, in my own conference, and certainly at Wirecard, there would have been people all around the company who noticed this. but for one reason or another, did not bring it up. And the word that comes up to me, and is hypnosis. I don't know anything about. I don't know much, but in some way, it feels to me like there's a kind of hypnosis that's taking place that is kind of like taking that part of the analyst's brain and just shutting it down. I don't know if you, and in the very beginning of the book, Dan and Chris talk about mentalists, and they kind of, I think you do a pretty good job of debunking what mentalists do, but I wouldn't want to get, you can go into a debate with my wife and other people who totally believe in that stuff. And so, in a certain way, they induce all sorts of people in the audience to believe that what is happening is reality when it's not. And there's something really powerful there that when it's a mentalist in a room, who cares? But when it's a whole bunch of investors that we're kind of defrauded, I don't know if you can, is my description of hypnosis, does it hit pay dirt with you, or am I just going the wrong direction here?
I would think of it more as social pressure, right? That, if you're at a mentalist show and you don't believe what they're doing, so most of the people who are there want to believe, right? If you're there and you don't believe, it'd be really awkward to stand up in the middle of it and say, that's nonsense, you're faking this, right? First, it'd be hard to do, right? Because you want to be absolutely sure before you accuse somebody of cheating, right?
Yeah.
So if you're in a meeting and you're hearing things that don't sound right to you, there probably are plenty of people there who also say that doesn't sound right. But being a whistleblower and standing up and chatting, nobody likes whistleblowers, right? I mean, everybody wants them to do their thing, but nobody likes them, and that's a really hard position to put yourself in. It's a risk. Right?
So two stories there. It reminds me of me being, at one point in my life when I lived in New York, I was just exploring I went to Anthony Robbins seminars, as you'll know from my book. I also went to one landmark forum where at least I wasn't buying any of what was going on there. And at some point they understood that I hadn't said anything, but somebody just came and asked me to leave the room. So I guess that was...
Just your skeptic energy. Yes, your skeptical energy was infecting everybody else or something like that.
That's exactly how stage hypnosis works, right? So when a stage hypnotist is performing, they want to bring people on stage who are the most suggestible, right? So they do suggestion tests and see how well people in the audience are. So they might, for example, have you imagine that you've got a helium balloon tied to one finger on one hand and you're holding a brick in the other hand.
Yeah.
And they have people do this sort of mental, imagination task. And they only bring people on stage who have one hand way up to the sky and the other way down near the ground. For me, as a sort of skeptical person, I've been in those, and it's like, okay, my hands are exactly the same height. It just doesn't affect me. They don't want me on stage, right? They don't want people who are
absolutely
questioning. So, and once they bring people up on stage, they continue that process and just send people off stage when they aren't going to work well for them.
And
I was going to say,
go ahead.
Oh, sorry. I was going to add to that I think I agree with Dan. Hypnosis is not the right, is not the right way of looking at it. But I think mentalism is not that bad a lens, because one of we put our story of John Edward, the psychic medium, or the quote unquote psychic medium, in the first chapter of our book, as a way of illustrating the concept of focus, and how we don't think about the information we're not being shown, or that we're not paying attention to, or that has sort of gone by so quickly that we've forgotten it by the time we need to make a decision. And I think maybe what's happening in a lot of these cases is, although people become aware of something fishy going on at some point, if it's out of sight, it's out of mind, right? They don't think about that. They don't focus on that. That's not the focus of what they're working on. It's very easy to not consider something that is not put right in front of you. That's the principle of focus. And you have to sort of take a deliberate decision to sort of think about it, ask what's missing, ask what I'm not being shown. I think that is a lot of what's going on. And I guess one thing, I can see why you'd feel bad about having invited Carvana to present at your own conference and then asking the tough question yourself. But maybe next time you could text a friend, who's sitting in the room someplace else, and say, could you ask him this? Or don't you think someone should ask him this? And maybe that's a way of getting around the social awkwardness of it, or something like that. Because I would feel it myself, right? When you're the host of the visiting speaker, in a department, you don't want to be the one asking the really hard questions. That just seems gauche. That's just not something you want to do.
And it seems to me, I mean, when it comes to, so funnily enough, in your book, and we don't need to dwell on it for very long because it's a subject of active debate. So there's all the examples, and social media really amplifies this. People who claim that they had adverse reactions or even died after taking the COVID vaccine. And the simple question is, well, how many people died who didn't take the COVID vaccine? And the simple statistic misleads me. And I feel like I want to kind of just train that muscle. So reading about in the book, train the muscle just a little bit. And in that case, it's nefarious. And in so many cases of snake oil, I did this and it cured me. It's nefarious. And I think that you're absolutely right to be to be public voices on this. I think it's really, really important, although I don't envy it because you probably make a lot of enemies. Because people don't like, I mean, in a certain way, you're pricking bubbles and people are telling the story for a reason and you're kind of saying no. And I really appreciate, I mean, there's a lot actually. I didn't realize I appreciate the newspapers that publish it. You don't make yourself popular by doing it, but you're doing God's work in a certain way. I'm kind of publicly thanking you for it. But then, well, maybe we can go here. And this is well, it was in sort of like some notes that I sent beforehand. But it seems to me that there are whole businesses that are actually not harmful that are built on some of these ideas. And I've been spending a lot of time thinking about luxury goods and how there's a kind of a sleight of hand that takes place. And I don't know if you guys have thought about it. And maybe I should not preempt what you might say to it, but I'm sure you've looked at the apparent irrationality of somebody queuing up outside a Louis Vuitton store to buy a totally overpriced handbag because it makes them feel good. I don't know if before I could dive in with my reactions, but
so I think those are economically fascinating areas. I think you could make an analogy to fine art and maybe fine wine and almost any collectible thing. Like the collectability of it has nothing to do with its inherent utility or usually cost of manufacturing or any other metric that you would usually want to use to like financially value something, right? Like none of those really seem to apply. It's only the demand for the thing. So it's an interesting process of and I think the principle that we talk about in the book that may have the most to do with it is this idea of familiarity. So in the case of brands, right, what a brand is doing in part is sort of becoming more and more well known and more familiar, and that merely by itself seems to attract more, desire for it, more trust in it, whatever. And there's a lot of advertising that's purely geared towards making a name more familiar or making a concept more familiar or something like that. Doesn't even really tell you much about the qualities of the product, why you'd want to buy it. It just makes it something that you recognize or something that you associate with, with something familiar. That's a lot of advertising. I don't know if luxury goods, like you say, are special cases, but in some of them, the market has been around for so long that they actually, right, they actually do have some value, right? You buy, you buy a diamond, you can be pretty guaranteed you're going to be able to resell it if the time comes that it has intrinsic value. Even some handbags seem to do that, right? Even sneakers, by the way. I don't know if you're familiar with the sneaker market, right? But collectible sneakers, thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of dollars for sneakers.
So I would argue that is an example of this focus idea. So I believe, I don't know, that the luxury goods companies will want to create examples of one sneaker of Nike that sold for a very high price. And so that sticks in your mind, but how many of them didn't? We don't know that. And the guy walks around talking about that, but we don't know how many didn't. And so I think that I think at the end of the day, taking advantage of human irrationalities to create demand for something or to create desire for something is probably a harmless activity. It's not nefarious in any way in the way that, what was a hydroxy something is selling somebody snake oil that may actually be harmful to them and convincing them of something.
Yeah,
and
there are degrees of horrible, right? There are degrees of fraud that sometimes are and deception that are deliberately intending to hurt people and take advantage of them, and others that are like letting people take advantage of themselves. And
I guess one can leave it at that. One that for me is kind of nefarious but legal is the newsletter business in financial markets. Is that, and I think that you give an example of this where, why don't I just live my life making thousands of predictions on a daily basis that are written up somewhere, and then I'll selectively write up the ones that were actually true and look like I'm a genius, whereas actually I'm not. And there's an example of an advisor to Boris Johnson, a guy called Dominic Cummings, who's a really fascinating mind. He's a really smart guy, but his reputation took a hit when somebody was able to show that he'd retrospectively gone back and changed a blog post on his website to make it look like he'd predicted something, which was, and a different way of doing that, which would have been harder to detect, would have been that he posted a lot of blogs, and then all the ones that didn't appear to predict the future, you just go and delete them and hope that, I guess there's a record of those on the web, but I really get the sense that you guys call each other up and you kind of say, did you see what just happened? This is BS. I think I'm going to have to write something on this.
Yeah,
you wouldn't be wrong. You wouldn't be wrong about that. Although it's more, I mean, to be fair, it's more text messages because you can send links, and so on. Yeah. But I would say, especially as we get closer to publishing the book, like every other day, there's at least something that goes back and forth between us on this within this universe.
It's kind of an evergreen topic.
So let me challenge you on this, because one of the things that came up for me was that I loved the empirical side, and we kind of touched on it. There's this kind of like, what is true about the world and what stories do we want to tell? And stories can be inspirational. And so we may be able to prove that this kind of manifesting stuff, I'm blanking on the right term. And people believe that if you focus on something and if you believe it will happen, it will happen. And maybe that's empirically false, but actually people who believe that are going to live more motivated, enthusiastic lives and thus achieve more success. And so, yeah.
Maybe. What's the evidence for that second claim, right? So I think that's what people would like to believe, that it's harmless to believe that if I just think about something, it will come to me eventually, which is kind of what this concept of manifesting or the secret or the law of attraction, it goes by a lot of different names over time. But I'm not sure there's any actual evidence, sorry to be so empirical about it, that people who engage in that practice actually are causing themselves to get more of what they want. It could be that they're also, doing something else, which is the real cause of getting what they want. And, seeing themselves get it is not actually the cause. And there's even some research that suggests that, if you believe that stuff will just come to you, if you think more about it, you'll actually be less motivated to go out and work for it. So I think it's a very, this to me is not, maybe this is not on the horrible side, but it's not necessarily on the harmless side. To me, it's on like a little bit on the edge between, between negative and harmless. I think for a lot of people, it probably is harmless. And for a lot of people, it's just a vocabulary of talking about, when they say, oh, I manifested that. I think sometimes maybe they just mean like, oh, I thought about that happening and then it did happen. They might not be really believing that they caused it to happen with their minds, just by thinking hard. But for other people, I think it is. And for the people who promote these ideas, often they will explicitly blame victims of bad things for saying the bad things must have happened to those people because they thought about the bad things. Right. And that seems a bit pernicious. That's probably not why a tsunami kills people, because like the people who got killed were thinking bad thoughts, or thinking too much about death or something.
I mean, all the stories that people can tell that don't sell books don't get written up because they don't sell books, And I kind of, I realized that most people, many people, you have this flush of getting married. And so this brief, my wife and I got married, and then we went through like a sort of like, we joke about it. We're going to celebrate 20 years coming up this year. And we say, well, the first 19 years are a nightmare and it gets better in the 20th year. I think that most marriages go through a kind of a lull, a difficult period where you're kind of figuring out how to live with each other. No books about that. Lots of books about how to prepare for a marriage. No books, nobody wants to buy that book. You get the chance to, and you can be very, don't worry about any hurt feelings here, but I'll try you. So one is that I think that there is empirical evidence that optimists do better in life than pessimists. So even if they cannot, so I'll just stop there because I made a bold claim with two professors. So
the first question is define do better. Right? What do you mean by do better? Right. And that's a really important question, right? It could mean do better financially. It could mean are more successful. It could mean they're happier. It could mean that they, are less affected by trauma or other problems. It could mean lots of different things. And depending on which ones you want to claim it do better, you might do worse at other things, right?
I'll explore my inner so an author that is not mentioned in the book. I will explore my inner Deepak Chopra. I hope that Deepak, you're not offended by any of this, but I want to pick the version that makes the data work. How does that?
Well, if you
better, I want to pick whatever the data will tell me is empirically provable.
Well, if you're looking for, if you're looking for an argument for why optimists do better, you have many different outcomes, as Dan points out, that you can pick from, right? And so if I say optimists do better because they're happier, but in fact, the truth also is that they, are poorer and they die earlier. Yeah. Like, you may not think about that. You might just think, oh, optimism makes me happier. That's great, and we won't think about the other stuff. I mean, also, in any claim like this, the thing that I would point to is often there is a shared cause that can cause those things. It can cause the optimism and the doing better, however it's defined. And that shared cause might, and the big hidden shared cause that most people don't think of when it comes to behavioral things like this is genes. So, your genes are not determining how optimistic you are. They're not determining how long you live or how much money you make, but genetic differences between people do influence differences in personality, differences in cognitive ability, differences in attitudes and beliefs and things like that. So that's always like the hidden thing that could be in common when you read about these sort of observational correlations between between things like that.
So it might be the case that even if people who are more optimistic are happier, right? It might not be that optimism is causing the happiness. Right. It could be that happiness is causing the optimism. It could be that a third factor is causing both. So that if you take somebody who's really sort of pessimistic and constantly skeptical and negative and dour, and you make them an optimist, that's not necessarily going to make them a happy person. Yes. Right. And that's the real challenge for this sort of observational claim. Right. And first you have to define it.
What's really bothering me right now is that, so you're both probably familiar with New York City. I used to live on West 67th Street, just close to a Barnes and Noble, which was on Lincoln Square there, just in front of the Metropolitan Opera. And actually, the entrance that I would go in was even closer to the self-help section, and I inhabited the self-help section a lot. And what I realized is that a lot of these stories that I was reading, are really, and I just wonder how much of my models of how the world works have been impacted by these. And you debunk some in the book, and actually I've been badly served by reading all of those self-help books.
Well, first of all, that Barnes and Noble sadly no longer is open. I happen to know, but by a strange coincidence, Dan and I went to that Barnes and Noble after appearing on TV when our first book came out, and someone had just seen us and recognized us going up the escalator. It wasn't one of the only times we've been recognized in public as the authors of The Invisible Gorilla. So I have a fond memory of that particular Barnes and Noble.
It was great.
We have to go. It was like 3 floors or something like that. It was a huge multi-floor with it. Well, I think on the one hand, I agree with you that you can be badly misled by these things, but I think people are sometimes surprised to hear me say that, oh, I read Malcolm Gladwell's stuff and I listen to his podcast and I like reading his stuff and so on, because I think if you approach any literature like this with the right mindset and with the right understanding, you can sort of filter it for, here's maybe some inspirational examples of things, that happened and so on, but discard the cause and effect claims, that those are where they really get into trouble in almost all this literature. But I think the stories and the examples are good if you give them the appropriate weight.
It's a chance for reflection, right? There's nothing wrong with self-reflection.
And actually, I happen to believe, having written a mid-career memoir, that so many of these things by non-academics. So for your interest, I kind of get this publishing contract and I say I have to take it, and then I have this. I mean, it's like a total crisis for about 2 years because I've decided I'm going to produce something, even if it's bad. But I think the intelligent choice that the only thing that I could write about authoritatively was myself. And all of the issues, all of the problems that you point out in these books go away when you just have the author not claim a universal law, but say that this was my personal experience or this was the story.
Yeah, I did read I did read your book, and I did get that sense actually that it was very much a, here's what happened to me, take from it what lessons you want to, and so on. And it was a little bit unusual in that respect compared to compared to some, and I thought I learned a lot. I thought I learned a lot from it actually.
Thank you. As you know, because let's not forget we're here to promote Dan and Chris's book. I should tell you that I wouldn't say it's a frustrated academic, but after 2 years of working in consulting, I wasn't, I actually applied to do, at the Graduate School of Arts and Sciences, I applied and was accepted to do the BizEc program. I was a big fan of Five Forces, Michael Porter, and touch and go. I mean, I was so close to, so there's a part of me that would have liked to have been an academic, but I can tell you that the challenge of writing about reality as it's outside, as opposed to inside oneself, I think that anybody's thinking of writing a memoir, so long as you write honestly about yourself, I think that you're doing an enormous service to the world, and you'll take yourself on an adventure because somebody like Chris will read your book and then he'll say, "Oh, would you like to interview me?" And my partner in crime, Dan Simons, and that's just really, really wonderful. So, so many things to go into in the book, but I hope that I've given the listener a sense of, we don't actually have much time left if we're going to bring this in under 90 minutes. I have all these questions for the two of you, which are kind of like outside of the book, and I can go above an hour and a half if you want. You just have to indicate that to me. But I think that where I want to go first is, so there's experimental psychology, which is where you are. Cognitive psychology, it's a science, and then there's a whole other areas of psychology or study of humans and human behavior, which go into, on the one hand, psychiatry, which is medicine. And there's another area which I think is fascinating, which is like sort of Carl Jung, archetypes, psychotherapy, all of that jazz. And I'd love to just get 2 words on why you chose to go into the field that you did and how you feel about those other kind of related fields.
I would say they're really completely different fields, right? So there's a fairly substantial split in the field of psychology. So if you look at academic departments, there's kind of a clinical area, and then there are all of the other areas, right? And in psychology, if you look at people who have a degree in psychology, the vast majority are clinicians, right? Therapists, people who are, and they're different kinds of degrees. And the training for that is very much different. There are clinicians, of course, there are clinical psychologists who do academic rigorous research on mental health and things like that, attention on things like emotion and depression and things like that. Then there are practitioners, and the practitioners largely are a separate group, right? That don't have that much connection with sort of the research end of things. And for me, I was never particularly interested in the therapy end of things. I was much more interested in understanding the mind and behavior, and so that for me is where the path led. I also wasn't, my father was a doctor. I didn't have any interest in going into medicine.
There's an element to those professions which is helping humans live better lives, basically, as opposed to identifying what. I
often joke that I'm the kind of psychologist who doesn't like to help, doesn't try to help people. But I mean, it's not completely fair, but it not help them in a particular kind of way. But,
yeah. Do you want to?
We try to help with books. Yeah, we try to help with books instead of with one-on-one, therapy. I think ideally, I was never interested in being a clinical psychologist either. That would have been the farthest thing, from my mind. I got into this whole business sideways from computer science and artificial intelligence. But ideally, the clinical sides of psychology should be based on science, and some of them are. Right. So the thing about the clinical sides of psychology is there are varying levels of how much evidence they have backing, their methods, and how much connection there is to the rest of the science of psychology. Some of it is like totally off the rails, well, that was maybe unkind, but it's sort of, practices where there's a basis claimed for them that can't possibly be true, based on physics, and fundamental science and so on. And then there are, very, practices which are very much based on ideas from, let's say, cognitive psychology, and the study of memory and so on, and which are empirically tested themselves in clinical trials where patients will actually be randomly assigned to receive one kind of therapy or another kind of therapy, and then we measure them to see how depressed they are at the end of this treatment and so on. So there's a whole spectrum of that, but I think in my personal view, too much of it is sort of too disconnected from from the scientific side of psychology.
In my own department, for example, the clinical and counseling program in my own department, it's clinical and community psychology, but they're very much a science-based, evidence-based training program, right? So they're training people to become academics or to be rigorous, scientifically grounded therapists. And they get both of those sorts of training.
Yeah.
Some departments, other sorts of programs are not as focused on that. They're focused on the interpersonal aspects, which are important for therapy, right? But not so much important for the science end of things.
Yeah, I mean, you're not coming out with claims about what is reality, but you're coming out with a training that seems to make a lot of people feel better. And maybe you could even make claims that fewer people who go through your whatever it is commit suicide less often or something like that. But then, so I get to go to the other extreme, which is, there's a course at Stanford called Symbolic Systems that I think Peter Thiel did, and I think that in a different version of my life, it's kind of like I did PPE at Oxford, and it's kind of like a PPE for scientists. And mathematics, physics, those are all studying how the world works. Why would either of you not have gone into those kinds of subjects? Let's say, why study of the mind, actually? And the satisfaction, I'll just push it a little bit further. So the satisfaction, I mean, I have friends who are mathematicians, there's no issues with people making claims that can be are provably false in mathematics. It's just so obvious. It's right there on the paper, so it's great for empiricism.
Okay, so there are two answers. One, math was too hard and physics were too hard for me. I actually did take some courses in those, and those are among my lowest grades that I've ever received. But also, computer science was just interesting. So I just followed what was interesting, and I was interested in computers for a long time, like ever since fifth grade. And this is back when you had to type on these terminals, and it would type out on a roll of paper, and so on. And serendipity, like one of my friends had taken a cognitive psychology course and he was going to work in the psychology department. So I did what he did. And then I found out it's all, I didn't set out to say like, oh, what's the thing I should major in that would really, solve this. It was really a lot of serendipity that led me to the, to the ultimate location.
Completely the same for me. Yeah. I don't believe arts undergrad.
Sorry, Dan. I don't believe for 1 minute that you got bad grades in maths. I really don't. I really, really don't. But,
I'm not going to send you my transcript, but you'll just have to take my word for it. Why would I lie? Why would I lie about that? I guess maybe I'm a fraudster and I'm just establishing credibility here by sort of like disclosing things that are really not true, and I'm doing it to gain your trust and establish credibility.
But maybe you got bad grades because the math just wasn't interesting enough, and when you would have gotten to the higher, more interesting maths, that's when your excellent grades would have come out, because you weren't yet at the stage in maths where you were required to think truly creatively. And I'm pushing.
You're optimist. You're clearly one of those optimists, who. No, I think that's an optimistic view, but I think unfortunately, it could be that if I had worked harder at it, I would have done better. Maybe there was something about it that turned me off. Certainly, some of the professors were not necessarily like the greatest teachers, right? They were great mathematicians, but maybe not necessarily the greatest teachers. But I truly wound up believing that although I'm probably better than average at math, and some aspects of math, the kind of math that you need to understand to really go deep into that field, right? That I was not, that I was just not as good at. But who knows? Maybe I'm wrong.
Yeah. I would just share with you that there's the YouTube has done amazing things for chess. I think there's a guy called John Bartholomew I never had the opportunity and the time to kind of hang out and get chess lectures, for example. And so now I can get concepts explained to me online, which is just phenomenal. And there's a guy who explains mathematics on a channel called 3 Blue 1 Brown. And it's really so inspiring. And it's these areas of mathematics which have got no practical use, pure mathematics, which is, group theory, and what group theory is just like, and I don't even not sure I understand it, and I'm not going to dive into it right now because I'll just embarrass either me or my here math professor friend. So the listener, now I get to do what I wanted to do all along, which is just ask you guys about bridge and chess, because I'm a bit of a fanboy of anybody who is on the chess front, which I know a little bit more about. But it seems like, Dan, you play bridge, but
Yeah.
Chris, you don't.
I'm not necessarily good, but
Yeah, but
I've
and
played for a while.
there's a because bridge has got this element of new information appearing. You don't have complete information, and you have to update probabilities as to what you would do. That it seems to me that there's extraordinary overflows between that and investing. And we know that some, Warren Buffett and Charlie Munger play bridge.
Mhm.
And I happen to enjoy chess more. I'm not sure why. Maybe it's just because I can't get 4 people together to play bridge with me. But do you want to comment on why bridge versus chess or vice versa?
I think the main difference is that uncertainty. You have to make a lot of inferences in bridge, right? So you have to sort of make your best guesses about what somebody else has in their hand. Whereas in chess, there's no ambiguity about what the situation is. It's right there on the board, right? So
Yeah.
you don't have to worry about what somebody is in somebody's head. You have to think about what could an opponent, whoever they are, play. Whereas in bridge, you really have to draw inferences both from how people bid, what bids they play, but also how they've played about what else is still in their hand. So yeah, it's updating your model of the world, right, based on uncertainty and based on limited information. So I find that aspect, really appealing and really difficult. My working memory capacity just isn't strong enough to really maintain everything. I'm not an experienced enough player. And it's interesting, as a bridge player, I started playing, maybe in my late 30s in the club, and I was by far the youngest person there. And there are great bridge players who are 90 years old, which is an amazing thing to be able to do at 90. The working memory capacity to play bridge is remarkable. So there's a lot of pattern recognition, and there's a lot of sort of inference based on it. You get a lot more experience at knowing what inferences to draw under different conditions. But there's also sort of a game theory aspect to it, which is that when you play duplicate bridge, you're playing the same hands. It's fully sort of designed like a good experiment. It's counterbalanced across all of the people so that everybody is playing the same hands just against different opponents. So you're comparing how you did with those cards to how other people have done with those cards, which means anticipating what's the likely pattern what's the likely game that people are going to play, what's the likely bid that they're going to make, and can I do something that would give me a higher score than them, even if it might not be the obvious play, right? So there's that aspect of it too, which is really interesting.
I've not yet met somebody who enjoys playing duplicate bridge, but I'm curious. So I'm going to mention the name of a friend of mine I think he's rated about 1900 in chess, and he lives in New York City, and he plays a lot of bridge now, not so much chess. And his name is Patrick Kestenbert. And so let's just imagine that we're going to get together, the 3 of us and Patrick, and I offer you, Dan, we can play bridge or we can play chess. Which do you pick for an evening?
Probably chess.
Chess. There you go.
Yeah, I mean, bridge, I actually prefer the idea of duplicate bridge much more than I like just playing party bridge.
Random.
Right, with 4 people, because it's like the randomness plays a much bigger role in just party bridge with 4 players, whereas in duplicate, some of the randomness is eliminated.
Yeah, well, you can find out how you did against everybody else, basically.
Yeah.
But...
Well, and if there's something systematic about it, it's not just which cards you happen to get, it's did you play those cards as well as somebody else did? So there's a more direct sort of competitiveness to it in a way that isn't there in party bridge, at least for me.
And before I go to Chris, and this will, unless this, so we've gone over an hour and a half. I presume you guys have another 5 or 6 minutes to wrap this up. You're not standing somebody up or anything. And
but yeah, I do have to go pretty soon. So
yeah. So 5 or 6 minutes. And so Chris, same question to you. Would it be chess, or do you hate bridge? Or I heard Dan say poker.
I have never played 1 second of bridge in my life, and so I think you guys would have to start by teaching me how to play, and then it might be kind of boring for you, because it takes me actually a while to learn, new games and so on. So maybe we should settle on poker. Since everybody knows how to play poker and there's enough randomness, it's good for, it's good for a party atmosphere and so on. I mean, the thing with chess, I think chess is often contrasted, like Dan did, with card games, because there's perfect information, right? You have,
Wow.
where all the pieces are, and so on. But on the other hand, there's so much complexity that it winds up being a lot of uncertainty, sort of reintroduced by the complexity. Like, there might be like 40 moves that are possible to play in the average, configuration of pieces on the board. There might be 40 different moves you can play. Well, you can't look at all of those except in very extreme circumstances, when you have to. And 40 times 40 is 1600. So there's no way to analyze all the possibilities, for into the future unless you're a computer. So you wind up, making a lot of inferences, making a lot of predictions, trying to make sure that you haven't overlooked, any important pieces of information and considered important, important moves. And sadly, there are no great 90-year-old chess players. So maybe that will be the impetus for me to learn bridge, as I get closer to. My father lived to be 97, so there's a chance that I'll still be around at 90, and I need something to do. And a lot of chess is cognitively taxing, I think, in a way that some other games are not, especially in that a single game can last 5 or more hours. On the other hand, I find it sort of a beautiful experience to get to lock my phone literally in a box in the tournament room for an over the board like chess tournament, lock my phone in the box, think about nothing else but the game, for the next 5 hours. It's like a mentally cleansing experience, really, especially in the today's world, right, where you've got notifications and all these different things and so on, to sort of really be able to, to focus on just one thing. And it also it provides an excellent, I think, a very pure way to sort of measure your own progress, which doesn't exist in a lot of other areas, right? Like investing, you know, you're doing great, but there's a lot of variance involved and a lot of factors beyond your control and so on. Um, in Even in poker, right? A lot of people convince themselves they're great at poker because they got lucky a couple of times, a couple of critical hands in critical tournaments or games, right? And they, that made the difference. It's hard to deceive yourself, for very long in chess. Some people still manage to do it, but it's really much harder than in all these other areas.
And just for the listeners' interest, and I really forgive me if you're not interested in these games, but in chess, there's a rating system that is based on statistics, which updates based on a win, loss, or a draw, the probability of you winning or losing against a player of a similar rating. And so you kind of get a result on every rated game that you play. And I just have a rule: every single game I play is rated. But I'll leave you, Chris, with two questions. Chris has appeared on chess podcasts and he's edited chess magazines, and he's very, very knowledgeable in that area. I for the first time in my life met a guy who I was on a board and he had his back turned to me. He was playing in his head. And now I figured out that when I can't sleep, I can try and do that, and I can't even visualize the board. And then some academic article that has your name on it, Chris, talks about how the chess players who do that are not actually visualizing the board. They have in their mind sort of structures, and the structures are kind of, they're not just like seeing what the board looks like, which is, to me, is utterly fascinating. And I'm going to add that with another question, then you can just riff on it, which is, and I think many people would ask this question. I mean, I think there are many investors listening to this who will ask themselves, who will say, I'll go play chess if it'll make me a better investor and a better thinker. And the argument would be that the muscles that you exercise in chess are applicable elsewhere. And so have fun just responding to that, either of those two, both.
Yeah, that's probably a good place to end, because that last question does kind of relate back to some of what we talk about in certain parts of the book. So the first question is, yes, I think the visualization that people do in chess, like classically chess thinking, is if I move my knight there, then he'll move his rook there, and then I can move my pawn there, and then he'll take my bishop with his queen, and that's bad. So let me think of something else, right? It's like this process of thinking ahead and then unwinding back to where you are and thinking ahead. And how do we visualize those changes? So I think it's pretty clear that what we don't do is sort of maintain like a photograph of the chessboard in our minds and sort of slide a wooden thing, like, slide an image of a wooden piece, back and forth. It's something more schematic than that. And there's I think, debate and experiments on sort of what exactly the natures are of that sort of schematic representation, but it's a kind of visualization that we do. It's not, we're not manipulating photographs in our mind, especially. It's probably much more efficient than manipulating photographs in your mind, because it doesn't matter like what color of the wood the pieces are, and whether they're wood or plastic, or whether they're like little diagrams on a computer screen, or three-dimensional things in front of you. It might make a tiny difference at the margins, but it doesn't really matter that much. I think where chess has the reputation as being the intellectual game. It's the it's a game that smart people are thought to play, that educated people are thought to like, and so on. And I think that has convinced people somewhat that by playing chess they can actually get smarter, or maybe that by having kids play chess, kids will do better in school. But it's an appealing story, right? Kind of like we were talking about earlier. It's an appealing story, and there's a logic to it. It's not ridiculous. It's not like by chewing gum we're going to get smarter. It's actually something that plausibly could maybe make us smarter. But pretty much every time someone has run a legitimate experiment to test that, they have found that although kids seem to like playing chess and learning chess, and they get better at chess, their math scores don't go up. Their reading scores don't go up. And it's a classic example of like one of these cases where it's a sometimes sold as an intervention that will sort of solve educational problems and so on. If only we would just teach everyone chess. And unfortunately, it's probably not. It's probably not that simple. So I would say the best thing about chess is that it's a very enjoyable activity that you can find a lot of meaning in and find a lot of lifelong happiness from. But I wouldn't use it as like an instrument to try to make myself better at something other than chess. Like that's the thing, right? Like be good at chess and enjoy chess and love love everything about it. But I don't think if you want to be a better investor, there are probably better things you can do with your time than try to become a chess expert.
There are better things you can time. That gives me a great way to close this down, which is you could, and I'm being a little bit promotional, but I'm allowed to be because it's not my book. You could buy Nobody's Fool and study it carefully and learn the patterns of deception, self-deception, others deceiving us in a certain way. There's no doubt that we'll be better societies with more people in there who do that. So that's what you can do if you don't want to play chess or poker or bridge. Last word, Dan, last word, Chris, and then I'll thank you both.
No, just thank you for having us on. It was a really fun conversation.
Yeah, this has been great fun. I really enjoyed it, and thanks for having us. Thanks for having us on your podcast.
Yeah, and thank you both of you. I suspect that you're going to be doing a lot of talking in various places, and it's a privilege that you're willing to talk to me and my audience. What fun! Thank you so much.